What if one of the most famous civilizations in human history never actually disappeared? It simply changed its name. For centuries, the world spoke about Persia, a land of powerful emperors, magnificent palaces, legendary warriors, and poets whose words traveled across continents. But today, that same land is known by a completely different name: Iran. So what happened? Did Persia vanish? Did a new country rise in its place? Or is the truth far more complicated than the history books ever explained? Because the reality is this: Persia never truly disappeared. Its identity evolved, reshaped by wars, empires, religions, and one decision in the 20th century that permanently changed how the world refers to an ancient civilization. And once you understand the full story, you begin to realize something surprising. The change from Persia to Iran was not just about a name, it was about power, identity, and how a nation chooses to present itself to the world. But to understand how Persia became Iran, we must travel back thousands of years, long before the rise of famous empires, long before Alexander the Great marched east, and long before the modern world even existed. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten stories like this one, make sure to subscribe to Hidden History, where we explore the secrets the past tried to bury. Now let's begin the journey. Long before the modern Middle East took shape, there was a vast region known today as the Iranian Plateau. Stretching between towering mountain ranges, scorching deserts, and ancient trade corridors, this land sat at the crossroads of civilizations. Caravans carrying silk, spices, and precious metals traveled across it for centuries. But merchants were not the only things moving through this region. Ideas moved through it. Languages moved through it. Cultures and identities were constantly reshaped here, and sometime around the second millennium BCE, new people began arriving in this rugged land. These were the Indo-Iranians, nomadic tribes who spoke early Indo-European languages. Their distant linguistic cousins would eventually become the speakers of Greek, Latin, Germanic languages, and many others across Europe. Even their ancient words carried familiar echoes. The word for mother was matar. The word for father was pitar. Thousands of years later, those sounds still echo in words like mater, mother, and pater across different languages. But these tribes were not one unified nation. They were many groups, scattered across valleys and plains. Among them, two would rise to historical importance: the Medes and the Persians. At first, the Medes were the dominant force. They settled in the northwestern region of the plateau and gradually built a powerful kingdom that controlled much of the surrounding territory. They organized armies. They established strong political leadership. And for a time, they were the rulers of the region. The Persians, however, were different. They settled farther, south, in a region called Pars. This land would eventually give rise to the name the world would remember for centuries: Persia. But at this stage in history, the Persians were not yet a dominant power. They were simply one tribe among many. Their territory was relatively small, their influence limited. No one living at that time could have imagined that these people would one day rule one of the largest empires the world had ever seen. Because at that moment, the word Persia did not describe an empire. It described only a small geographic region. But history was about to change, and the transformation would begin with one extraordinary leader. His name was Cyrus, and the world would eventually remember him as Cyrus the Great. Cyrus was not born into a weak tribe, dreaming of power. He was born into a world already dominated by the Medes. But unlike many leaders before him, Cyrus had a vision that went far beyond tribal rivalries. Instead of accepting the old power structure, he challenged it. Around the middle of the 6th century BCE, Cyrus launched a rebellion against Median rule. What followed was not simply a political revolt. It was the beginning of something far greater. Cyrus defeated the Medes and united their territories with those of the Persians. But instead of destroying the Median culture, he absorbed it. Instead of ruling through fear, he ruled through something far more effective: respect. This approach would soon become the foundation of the Achaemenid Empire, the first great Persian empire. And unlike many conquerors of the ancient world, Cyrus did something unusual. When he conquered new territories, he did not erase their traditions. He allowed people to keep their religions. He restored temples. He respected local customs. For many populations under his rule, Cyrus was not seen as a tyrant. He was seen as a liberator. When he captured Babylon, he even allowed the Jewish population who had been exiled there to return to their homeland. This decision would echo through history for centuries, because Cyrus understood something many rulers did not. Empires built on fear often collapse quickly. Empires built on loyalty can endure. And under Cyrus and his successors, the Persian Empire expanded rapidly. Soon, it stretched from the Indus River in South Asia all the way to the Mediterranean Sea, from Egypt in the west to Central Asia in the east. It connected dozens of cultures, languages, and religions under one administrative system. Road networks were built across thousands of miles. A sophisticated postal system allowed messages to travel across the empire with remarkable speed. Governors known as satraps managed distant provinces while remaining loyal to the central authority. For the ancient world, it was an unprecedented achievement. Some historians even describe it as the first true superpower. But even the greatest empires face moments that test their strength. And eventually, a challenger would appear from the west, a young king with unstoppable ambition. His name was Alexander, and his arrival would change the fate of Persia forever. In 334 BCE, a relatively small army crossed the narrow strait separating Europe from Asia. Its leader was not yet 30 years old, but he carried a dream far larger than his army. His goal was simple: defeat the Persian Empire. That young king was Alexander of Macedon, and within a few years, he would become known across the world as Alexander the Great. Through a series of brutal battles, including the famous confrontations at Granicus, Issus, and Gaugamela, Alexander shattered the military power of the Persian Empire. Cities fell, armies collapsed, and the Achaemenid dynasty that had ruled vast territories for generations finally came to an end. But something unexpected happened after Alexander's victory. Instead of destroying Persia completely, he began to admire it. Alexander adopted Persian clothing. He married Persian royalty. He used Persian administrative systems. He even participated in cultural traditions that shocked many of his own Greek soldiers. To them, this felt like betrayal. They had marched east, believing they were conquering Persia. Yet now their leader seemed to be becoming Persian himself. But Alexander understood something deeper. If he wanted to rule such a vast empire, he could not rely on conquest alone. He needed legitimacy. He needed cultural unity. He needed a civilization where East and West could coexist. For a brief moment in history, it seemed possible, but Alexander's dream would not last. Because in the year 323 BCE, at just 32 years old, Alexander suddenly died. And with his death, the empire he built began to fracture. His generals fought among themselves. Territories were divided. Power shifted constantly. Yet despite all the chaos, something remarkable happened. Persia itself did not disappear. Its cultural identity remained alive beneath every new dynasty that ruled the land, and over the centuries that followed, that identity would slowly rise again. But first, another powerful force was about to arrive from the south, a force that would transform Persia in ways no conqueror before had managed. Because this time, the transformation would not only be political, it would be religious, and that change would shape the identity of the region for the next 1,400 years. But the next transformation of Persia would not come from the west. It would come from the deserts of Arabia. In the early 7th century, a new religious movement was rapidly spreading across the Arabian Peninsula. It began with the teachings of a man named Muhammad, who proclaimed a new faith built on the belief in one God. That faith was Islam. Within a single generation, armies inspired by this new religion began expanding beyond Arabia. They moved north, then east, and soon they arrived at the borders of the once mighty Persian world. At that time, Persia was ruled by the Sasanian Empire, a powerful dynasty that had revived many of the traditions of the ancient Persian kings. The Sasanians promoted Zoroastrianism, the ancient religion centered on the cosmic struggle between good and evil, and the worship of the god Ahura Mazda. For centuries, they had stood as one of the great powers of the world. But by the time Arab armies appeared, the empire was weakened. Years of war with the Byzantine Empire had drained its resources. Internal political conflicts had destabilized its leadership, and when the Muslim armies invaded, the Sasanians struggled to mount an effective defense. The decisive battles came quickly. At Qadisiyah and later Nahavand, Persian forces were defeated. Within a few decades, the Sasanian Empire collapsed. Persia had fallen. But once again, something remarkable happened. Even though the Arabs conquered the territory, the Persian identity did not vanish. Yes, Islam gradually became the dominant religion. Yes, Arabic became the language of administration and scholarship across much of the Islamic world. But Persian culture adapted rather than disappeared. The Persian language survived. It absorbed Arabic vocabulary while maintaining its own structure and identity. Persian scholars became some of the most influential thinkers in the Islamic Golden Age. Poets like Ferdowsi, Rumi, and Hafez wrote works that would shape literature for centuries. Persian scientists, mathematicians, and philosophers contributed to global knowledge. In many ways, Persian civilization became one of the intellectual centers of the Islamic world. But politically, the region remained unstable. Over the centuries, many different dynasties ruled the land. Turkic empires, local Persian kingdoms, and eventually, even the terrifying armies of the Mongols under Genghis Khan swept across the region. Cities burned, entire populations were wiped out. Yet even after such destruction, Persian culture continued to survive. It adapted, it evolved, it endured. Because by this time, Persian identity had become something deeper than any single empire. It was embedded in language, poetry, and shared historical memory. And eventually, that identity would be reshaped again under a powerful new dynasty, one that would permanently change the religious landscape of the region. In the early 16th century, a new force emerged from the region of Azerbaijan. Its leader was a charismatic young ruler named Shah Ismail. He founded the Safavid dynasty. But the Safavids were not simply another royal family competing for power. They had a far more ambitious goal. They wanted to transform the identity of the entire region. At the time, most Muslims across the Islamic world followed Sunni Islam. But Shah Ismail made a radical decision. He declared that his empire would follow Shia Islam, and more specifically, the branch known as Twelver Shi'ism. This was not a peaceful transition. The Safavids enforced their religious reforms through political pressure, propaganda, and sometimes violence. But the long-term consequences were enormous. Because from that moment forward, the Persian world developed a religious identity distinct from many of its neighbors. While much of the Islamic world remained Sunni, the Safavid state became the center of Shia Islam. This religious distinction still defines Iran's political and cultural identity today. Under the Safavids, Persian culture flourished once again. Magnificent cities like Isfahan became centers of architecture, art, and philosophy. Persian literature expanded, scientific scholarship continued, and the state once again began using an ancient name that had existed for centuries: Iran. The word came from the ancient term Aryanam, meaning land of the Aryans, or land of the nobles. Inside the country, many people had long used the word Iran to describe their homeland. But outside the region, foreigners still used a different name, the name they had known since the time of the Greeks: Persia. For centuries, both names existed side by side. To outsiders, the country was Persia. To many people living within it, it was Iran. And that dual identity continued for hundreds of years, until one moment in the 20th century changed everything. By the early 1900s, the world was rapidly changing. Empires were collapsing, new nations were forming. Industrialization was transforming societies across the globe. And in Persia, a new ruler came to power. His name was Reza Shah Pahlavi. Reza Shah had ambitious plans. He wanted to modernize the country. He wanted to strengthen its independence. And most importantly, he wanted to reshape how the nation was seen by the outside world. For many Western observers, the word Persia carried certain stereotypes. It was associated with exotic luxury, ancient myths, Orientalist imagery, and, in some cases, outdated colonial perceptions. Reza Shah believed the country needed a new international identity, one that reflected its ancient roots but also its modern ambitions. So in 1935, he made a symbolic but powerful decision. He sent an official request to governments and embassies around the world. From that moment forward, he asked that the country be called by its native name: Iran. It was not that the name Iran was new. It had existed for centuries within the country itself. But this was the moment when the global community was formally asked to adopt it. And gradually, the change spread. Maps were updated. Diplomatic documents changed. Newspapers and textbooks began using the name Iran. To many people inside the country, it felt like a reclaiming of historical identity. But not everyone agreed. Some intellectuals worried that abandoning the name Persia meant distancing the nation from its extraordinary historical legacy. After all, the name Persia had been associated with one of the greatest civilizations in history: Cyrus, Darius, ancient empires that shaped the world. Even today, many historians still use the word Persia when referring to the ancient past. But politically and internationally, the modern nation would now be known as Iran. And the story did not end there, because in 1979, another event would once again redefine the country's identity: the Iranian Revolution. The monarchy was overthrown. The Islamic Republic of Iran was established under Ayatollah Khomeini. Relations with Western powers deteriorated. Political tensions increased, and over time, global perceptions of the country shifted dramatically. For many people around the world today, the word Iran is often associated with geopolitics, sanctions, and international conflict. Meanwhile, the word Persia continues to evoke images of ancient splendor, poetry, art, and legendary kings. Two names, one land, two different ways of remembering the same civilization. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of this story, because the transformation from Persia to Iran was never simply about changing a word. It was about how a nation chooses to define itself, how it balances its ancient past with its modern identity, and how the rest of the world chooses to remember it. History is rarely as simple as it appears. Sometimes the biggest changes are not the fall of empires or the outcome of battles. Sometimes they are hidden in something as small as a name. And behind that name lies a story, thousands of years in the making. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten stories like this, make sure to subscribe to Hidden History, where we explore the events, civilizations, and mysteries that shape the world we live in today. And remember, the past is never truly gone. Sometimes it's simply waiting to be rediscovered.